The sun hung low over the fields of Aizu, bleeding crimson across the sky, as though the heavens themselves wept for the dead. Among the fallen, one figure remained upright, not by life, but by defiance. Clad in a crimson hakama and wielding a naginata slick with blood, she had severed over 200 heads in battle. Her name was Nakano Takeko, and she was not supposed to be there. As the bodies cooled in the fading light, her severed head was hidden in the folds of her sister's kimono, buried under a pine tree, so that the enemy would never claim it as a trophy. In a time when women were expected to be quiet, obedient, and invisible, Nakano carved her name into history with a blade and defied an empire. The story of Nakano Takeko begins not on the battlefield, but in the waning days of the Tokugawa shogunate, a time of mounting turmoil and irreversible change. For over 2 centuries, Japan had remained isolated under the rule of the Tokugawa regime, a military government that enforced rigid social hierarchies and absolute control. But by the mid-19th century, foreign ships, black, smoke-belching behemoths had begun appearing off the coast. Their arrival sparked a crisis that would unravel the very fabric of Japan. The West demanded trade, technology, and submission. Inside Japan, the ruling shogunate was fractured and weakened. Emperor Komei and later Emperor Meiji sought to reclaim power from the shogun, leading to a political and military showdown known as the Boshin War. It was a war not only of ideologies, modernity versus tradition, imperial restoration versus feudal control, but of generations. The youth, idealistic and drawn to Western technology, rallied behind the emperor and his promise of progress. The old guard, fiercely loyal to the Tokugawa way of life, resisted. They fought to the last breath to defend an order that had defined Japan for centuries. It was within this tempest that Nakano Takeko's story took shape. Born in 1847 in Edo, present-day Tokyo, Takeko was not raised as an ordinary girl. From an early age, her intellect stood out. She read Chinese classics, practiced calligraphy, and trained in martial arts, most notably the deadly art of naginata jutsu, the use of the curved polearm traditionally favored by female samurai. Her father, Nakano Hainai, was a samurai himself, and she was later adopted by her martial arts instructor, Akaoka Daisuke, who gave her rigorous training and education fit for a warrior scholar. In a society that dictated submission and domesticity for women, Takeko defied all norms. She was educated, skilled, and unrelenting. As the Boshin War erupted in 1868, Takeko, now 21, found herself caught in a country tearing itself apart. The shogunate's forces were retreating northward, forming a last stand in the Aizu domain, a Tokugawa stronghold in present-day Fukushima. The Meiji government, intent on crushing all resistance, laid siege to the region. The samurai of Aizu, including old men, young boys, and even women, prepared to fight to the death. But the shogunate would not officially allow women in its armies. Despite her training, her lineage, and her skill, Nakano Takeko was not invited to war. So she created her own path. With her sister Yuko by her side, and with other women of Aizu who refused to stand idle, Takeko formed an unofficial unit of onna-bugeisha female warriors of the samurai class. Clad in traditional red hakama trousers and wielding naginata, they would fight under no official banner, answer to no command but their own, and face near certain death for honor, family, and belief. They called themselves the Joshitai, the women's army. As autumn painted the trees of Aizu with blood-red leaves, the siege began. Bullets from Western rifles screamed through the air. Cannons roared. Steel clashed against steel. Nakano Takeko and her band of warrior women charged into the storm. No longer shadowed by the expectations of society, they became warriors in full, striking down enemies with precision and fury. But this story would not end in glory. Not for Takeko, not for Aizu, and not for the samurai world she had fought to protect. And yet, the true meaning of her sacrifice and the image of a woman who refused to be forgotten still echoes through the blood-soaked soil of a fading era. Before she ever stepped onto the battlefield, Nakano Takeko had already begun her quiet rebellion, not against men, but against silence. Born into a crumbling world of codes, honor, and vanishing traditions, her childhood was marked by a hunger for knowledge and mastery that refused to be caged. Takeko was born in 1847 to Nakano Hainai, a mid-level samurai serving the shogunate. Her family belonged to the Bushi class, a caste of warriors whose status had been both their privilege and prison. By the mid-19th century, the samurai were caught in a paradox, elevated in name, but increasingly irrelevant in power. Peace had dulled the edge of the warrior's sword. Many samurai, including her father, were forced into bureaucratic roles or ceremonial duties, while the new world encroached from the shadows. But Takeko was different. From a young age, she displayed intellectual brilliance. She read the Analects of Confucius and Chinese classics with a sharpness that unsettled the men around her. She wrote poetry not just with beauty, but with bite. And in her free time, she watched the warriors at practice not as a girl dreaming of princes, but as a pupil memorizing their every move. Recognizing her potential, Takeko's parents made an unusual decision. They placed her under the guardianship of Akaoka Daisuke, a respected martial arts master and scholar. In Edo, under his roof, she became both his adopted daughter and disciple. Here, she was trained rigorously in the art of the naginata, a long polearm with a curved blade that required precision, strength, and grace. Traditionally, the naginata had been entrusted to women of the samurai class, not only as a weapon of defense but as a symbol of inner fortitude. Takeko wielded it not as an ornament of status, but as a blade of destiny. She also studied calligraphy, strategy, Chinese literature, and the philosophies of duty, loyalty, and self-sacrifice, all the sacred ideals of Bushido. Daisuke taught her as he would a son, if not more harshly. Her limbs ached from sparring, her fingers ink-stained from long hours of study, but she did not falter. If anything, hardship only deepened her resolve. It was during these years that Takeko began to understand the impermanence of the world around her. Edo was no longer a sanctuary of tradition, it was restless. Foreign ships had forced Japan to open its ports. Westerners in strange clothes walked its streets. The old shogunate clung to its authority, but its grip was slipping. Rumors of civil war, assassinations, and rebellion spread like wildfire. And through it all, women like Takeko remained invisible, educated in private, trained in secret, expected to marry and disappear. But Takeko could not be contained within any role society offered her. After her formal training, she returned to Echigo Province, modern-day Niigata, where she worked as a teacher and martial arts instructor. She taught young girls literature, etiquette, and weaponry not simply to defend themselves, but to preserve a heritage that was vanishing. She taught them to walk with the grace of poets and strike with the resolve of warriors. Her school was small, unrecognized by any authority, but in it burned the embers of rebellion. And then, in 1868, everything changed. The Tokugawa shogunate, weakened and under pressure, attempted to assert control over Kyoto, the seat of the emperor. Forces loyal to Emperor Meiji, backed by southern clans like Satsuma and Choshu, and supported by Western weapons, declared open war. This was not merely a political conflict. It was an existential war for the soul of Japan. The Boshin War erupted in January, beginning with the Battle of Toba Fushimi. In its wake, cities fell. The Tokugawa armies retreated north, bloodied but unbroken. The imperial troops advanced with terrifying speed, bolstered by guns, cannons, and foreign tactics. Tradition bled beneath the boot of modernity. By autumn of 1868, the final Tokugawa loyalists had regrouped in the Aizu domain, a bastion of old-world loyalty. It was here that Takeko made her choice. She traveled to Aizu with her family, seeking shelter, but what she found was a war camp of desperation. The Aizu samurai, loyal to the Tokugawa to their last breath, were preparing for a siege. Boys as young as 12 were being armed. The elderly readied spears. The women officially were ordered to stay inside, to tend to the wounded, to prepare food, and to wait. Takeko refused. Denied permission to formally enlist, she gathered a group of women, many of them wives, daughters, and students of fallen samurai. Armed with naginata and clad in red hakama, the color of death in battle, they trained day and night. The unit was unofficial, unrecognized, but it was real, and in time, it would be feared. They were not naive. They did not expect to survive. But to Takeko and her comrades, death was not failure, it was fulfillment. To die for one's honor, for one's ancestors, was not an end. It was the ultimate act of defiance against erasure. As the Meiji forces closed in and the guns of modern war echoed across the valley, Nakano Takeko and her women stood ready. No flag would fly above them. No general would speak their names. But their blades would speak louder than any decree. They had come not to ask permission. They had come to write their own chapter of history with blood. The morning of the 10th of October, 1868, arrived not with the softness of dawn, but with the thunder of artillery. Smoke shrouded the ridges of Aizu as cannon fire tore through trees and homes alike. The Meiji imperial forces had begun their full assault. Encircling the city of Wakamatsu, they brought with them not only superior numbers, but modern rifles and Western-style tactics. The defenders, mostly samurai and conscripts, were vastly outgunned. The siege had begun. Inside the walls, chaos reigned. The cries of children mixed with the clamor of forging weapons. Old men took up spears for the first time in decades. Women prepared bandages in one hand and daggers in the other. For the people of Aizu, surrender was unthinkable. Their daimyo, Matsudaira Katamori, a loyal retainer of the Tokugawa shogunate, had declared, "Even if our bodies turn to dust, the bones of loyalty must remain." And among the defenders, there stood a figure who embodied that creed more fully than any samurai on the field, Nakano Takeko. Takeko and her band of onna-bugeisha had trained relentlessly in the weeks before the siege. There were not many accounts vary between 20 and 30, but their discipline was unmatched. These were not young girls drawn by fantasies of war. They were daughters of warriors, educated and trained to fight with the fluid, deadly grace of the naginata. Their red hakama fluttered like fire as they moved through the battlefield, their presence both ghostly and mesmerizing. The male commanders had dismissed them. Some believed it inappropriate for women to fight. Others feared the morale effects of seeing female warriors die in battle. But Takeko did not ask for permission. She carved her own place into the war. She and her unit acted independently, moving with precision through the outer defenses of Wakamatsu Castle. Their mission was both symbolic and tactical. Hold the line long enough for civilians to evacuate and for the last remaining troops to regroup inside the inner citadel. Then came the order to charge. Facing musket fire and shrapnel, Takeko led her women forward into the thick of battle near the Yanagi Bridge, one of the key entry points to the city. The enemy had not expected a charge, certainly not one led by women, and certainly not one so devastating. Takeko's naginata flashed through the air like a comet. She struck with ferocious accuracy, disarming, dismembering, and decapitating with every movement. Accounts from both Aizu and Meiji sources would later agree. She cut down dozens of men, perhaps over 100, in that single offensive. With each fallen foe, she advanced, her comrades close behind her, fighting in a circular formation to protect one another from ambush. Blood soaked the earth. The screams of dying soldiers were drowned by the thunder of rifles. The smell of gunpowder and death clung to the air. And still, Takeko fought. The Meiji troops, despite their numbers and weapons, were rattled. This was not the enemy they expected. These women did not retreat. They did not scream. They fought like shades of vengeance. Every swing of their naginata carried the memory of fallen fathers, betrayed lords, and a dying way of life. In that moment, they were not merely warriors. They were the spirit of Aizu made flesh. Takeko's sister, Nakano Yuko, remained close at her side, wielding a blade and watching with hawk-like precision. The two had fought together since childhood, sparred under the same roof, and now defended the same soil. But the tide of war is merciless. As Takeko struck down yet another enemy officer, a bullet found its mark. It pierced her chest. The force threw her backward, the naginata slipping from her blood-slicked hands. Her breath came short, her vision blurred. But even in that final moment, she did not beg for mercy. She knew what the enemy would do to her body, how they would display her head as a trophy, a warning, an insult. That could not be allowed. With her last ounce of strength, she turned to Yuko and whispered her final request, to be beheaded by her own sister and buried in secrecy so that the enemy would never claim her soul. Yuko, trembling but resolute, obeyed. Under the crimson leaves of a ginkgo tree in the courtyard of the Hokai temple, she buried Takeko's head herself. No fanfare, no priest, Only silence, dirt, and tears. There would be no glory in her death, no monument, no parade, but her spirit, unbending and unforgettable, would remain. Back on the battlefield, the women of the Joshitai continued to fight. Many fell. Some survived, but their charge, brief, furious, and unforgettable, left a scar on the Meiji ranks. They had seen courage, they had seen honor, and they had seen a woman die as a warrior, not a victim. As dusk settled over the shattered remains of Aizu, it carried with it the end of more than a battle. It marked the fading breath of a world that had resisted change until its very last heartbeat. And in its final gasp, it had spoken a name, Nakano Takeko, with reverence. The siege of Aizu came to its inevitable end, just weeks after Nakano Takeko's final charge. Wakamatsu Castle, battered by cannon fire, smoke-choked and surrendered on the 6th of November, 1868. Over 3,000 defenders were dead. The remaining samurai were stripped of their swords, their homes torched, their lands confiscated. It was not simply the fall of a city, it was the extinction of a code. The Meiji government, now triumphant, moved swiftly to dismantle the old samurai class. Hair was cut, swords were banned, armor was replaced by uniforms. The world Takeko had lived and died for was declared obsolete. And so, her story and those of her comrades began to fade into the shadows. No official record was kept of the Joshitai. Their names were not inscribed on monuments. Their sacrifice was not celebrated in the new schools or textbooks. The Meiji Restoration was to be a forward-looking revolution. There was no place in its narrative for a band of women who fought and died to preserve the past. But in the quiet places, in temples and farmhouses, in fading letters and whispered family memories, her name survived. Nakano Yuko, who had fulfilled her sister's final wish with her own trembling hands, lived on in the new Japan. She never forgot what they had done. She never let others forget either. It was Yuko who returned to the Hokai Temple in the years after the war, when peace had settled uneasily across the land. There, beneath the pine tree where she had buried Takeko's head, she placed a small stone marker, unadorned, unannounced. She did not need marble or gold to remember her sister. The earth itself bore witness. Aizu itself never truly healed. Once a proud stronghold of Tokugawa loyalty, it became a byword for rebellion, and therefore shame under the new imperial government. Survivors were exiled, taxed heavily, or forcibly relocated. The samurai of Aizu were painted as villains in the new official histories. Their resistance, their loyalty, their sacrifices were rebranded as obstinance and backwardness. But something strange happened in the years that followed. While the Meiji government tried to erase the past, the people began to reclaim it. In private, stories of Nakano Takeko began to resurface. Her former students passed down tales of her elegance and strength. The children of Aizu, forbidden to study her life in school, heard her legend at home. She became a quiet symbol, not of rebellion, but of dignity, of honor, of what it meant to stand and fight, even when the world insisted you had no right. It wasn't until the early 20th century that her name began to re-enter public consciousness. Local historians and descendants of Aizu warriors gathered accounts, preserved oral histories, and tracked down battlefield records. Among them were records of imperial soldiers who had written with awe, not mockery, of the red-skirted woman with the long blade, who had cut down men with terrifying precision. In 1931, more than 60 years after her death, a formal monument was finally erected at the site of her burial, the Hokai Temple in Aizu. Paid for in part by local women and girls who saw in Takeko a forgotten heroine, the monument stood not as a celebration of war, but as a quiet vindication of sacrifice. Her name, once ignored by the nation, was now carved in stone. And every year since, during the Aizu Autumn Festival, a procession of young girls marches through the streets, dressed in the red hakama and white kimono of the Joshitai. Naginata in hand, they walk not in sorrow, but in pride. They walk to remember. They walk to remind Japan of the warrior it tried to forget. Still, Nakano Takeko's story remains unfamiliar to many outside Japan, and even within it, her memory is a fragile one. She left behind no autobiography, no portrait painted in her lifetime. What we know of her comes from fragments, battlefield accounts, family letters, secondhand recollections. But in those fragments, a woman emerges not mythical, but fiercely real. A woman who saw the world she loved being torn apart and chose to meet its end with a blade in her hand rather than silence in her heart. She never married. She left no children. Her name was nearly buried with her. And yet, her legacy lives on in every girl who learns the art of the naginata, in every voice that refuses to be silenced, in every story, like this one, where forgotten heroes are remembered not for what they were expected to be, but for what they dared to become. Takeko's battle ended with a bullet, but her war against invisibility still echoes. After the dust of the Boshin War settled, Japan did not simply rebuild it, reinvented itself. The Meiji Restoration was more than a political realignment. It was a total cultural upheaval. Feudal domains were abolished. The samurai class, once the cornerstone of Japanese identity, was dissolved. In its place arose a modern conscript army, Western-style education, new industries, and a centralized imperial government obsessed with catching up to the West at any cost. To the architects of the new Japan, the past was a problem to be corrected. The image of the stoic, sword-bearing samurai once revered became a liability. There was no room in this new narrative for the likes of Nakano Takeko. She was not only a reminder of the Tokugawa past, but also a symbol of female agency in a nation bent on standardizing gender roles into something more civilized. The role of women in Meiji society was redefined under a new phrase, Ryosai Kenbo, good wife, wise mother. It was an ideal imported from Western gender theory, but grafted onto Confucian roots. Women were to be moral centers of the household, obedient to husbands, useful to the empire as bearers of children and shapers of future men. In this vision of progress, the female warrior was not just out of place, she was a threat to national stability. And so, the onna-bugeisha, the centuries-old lineage of women warriors, who had stood beside male samurai in times of war, were deliberately erased from textbooks, ceremonies, and cultural consciousness. Their stories were omitted, their names forgotten, their swords buried. The irony is cruel. The very women who had defended the honor of their domains, protected castles, and sacrificed themselves in loyalty to a system now extinct, were pushed out of memory by the very state that rose from the ashes of that sacrifice. Even Nakano Takeko's own legacy fell victim to that silence. Though her grave existed and her story passed quietly among those who remembered, she remained absent from the grand retellings of the Meiji triumph. It was as though history had blinked and she had vanished. But not completely. Outside the official histories, artists, poets, and later feminist scholars began to reclaim her memory. In the early 20th century, as Japan grappled with its identity amid modernization and militarization, some began to look backward not in nostalgia, but in reckoning. Who were the people lost in the pursuit of empire? What values had been discarded in the rush toward progress? And among these questions, Takeko's story began to resurface, not as a footnote, but as a mirror. She represented more than martial prowess. She was not simply a woman who fought, she was a woman who chose to fight when everything around her insisted that she could not. She chose loyalty when treachery was convenient. She chose to teach, to train, and to inspire in an age that told her to stay silent. In many ways, her life was a contradiction. A woman deeply rooted in tradition, who nevertheless subverted every norm of her time. She revered the samurai code, but fought without a daimyo's permission. She honored her heritage, but built her own command when none would give her one. She lived with dignity and died by her own terms. And perhaps that is why her memory endured in the cracks of official narrative. Because Nakano Takeko was not simply a casualty of war, she was a rebuke to erasure. The 20th century brought war again to Japan, this time on a scale unimaginable. And in that crucible, a new generation began to rediscover their forgotten heroines. Historians, particularly women, began collecting oral histories from the Aizu region. Takeko's name re-emerged, not as myth, but as fact. The more they looked, the more they found. Shrine records, battlefield reports, family scrolls, even imperial troop accounts that spoke with begrudging admiration of the woman in red who cut through their lines like flame. By the late 20th century, her name began appearing in school curricula in Fukushima Prefecture, Local museums began, including her in exhibits. Novels, manga, and historical dramas brought her story to wider audiences. But even now, her place in the broader national narrative remains fragile, more popular than institutional, more legendary than academic. And yet, in every retelling, in every reenactment during the Aizu Autumn Festival, her spirit rises again. The girls who wear red hakama and march in silence are not play acting. They are remembering. They are reminding Japan and the world that even in a time when the sword was being silenced, Nakano Takeko chose to lift hers high, because she understood something the empire tried to forget, that the courage to fight is not given, it is claimed. In the vast silence of history, some voices echo louder not because they shouted, but because they refused to be erased. Nakano Takeko never ruled an empire, never held a military title, and died before reaching the age of 22. And yet, more than 150 years later, her defiance still pierces through time like the blade she once wielded. What draws us to her story is not simply her skill with a weapon or her death in battle, but the meaning embedded within those final acts. She was born in an era defined by loyalty, raised under a fading code, and thrust into a war she had no place in. And still, she stood. When society closed its ranks, she opened her own. When the state refused to recognize her, she carved her name into its memory through action, not approval. In an age where female strength was relegated to the private sphere, she chose the battlefield, not for glory, not for personal ambition, but to defend something she believed in: a culture, a people, a way of life. And when her time came, she chose her own death, denying her enemies even the honor of taking her. This choice to meet the enemy with her own terms, to fight without recognition, and to die without surrender is what transformed her from a warrior into a symbol. The Japan that rose from her ashes was built on the ruins of her world. Its railways, factories, and foreign treaties were forged in the fires of Meiji Revolution. But it also built walls not just around its cities, but around its stories. And in doing so, it nearly forgot the cost at which its transformation came. Nakano Takeko is not merely a relic of that forgotten past. She is a reminder of what history often chooses to overlook: the quiet courage of those who fought without fame, those who defied norms not to destroy, but to preserve what they held sacred. In every society, such figures exist, inconvenient, unrecorded, too powerful to be wholly suppressed. And her legacy has proven more enduring than even the empire she died resisting. Today, her grave at Hokai Temple is visited not only by locals, but by students, scholars, feminists, martial artists, and travelers from around the world. Her name is taught in martial arts schools, etched into stone, and whispered in classrooms that once omitted her entirely. Films and books have begun to explore her story. Artists render her in brush and ink, imagining her last charge through clouds of gunfire and maple leaves. But her most enduring memorial is neither physical nor political. It is cultural. Each autumn, when girls as young as 6 don the red hakama and white sleeves of the joshi tie and march through Aizu streets with wooden naginata in hand, they resurrect something deeper than pageantry. They summon the spirit of a woman who proved that resistance can be elegant, that honor can wear a woman's face, and that remembrance is itself an act of defiance. In a world where power often buries those who refuse to conform, Nakano Takeko's story reminds us that it is possible to live by principle, to die with dignity, and to be remembered not because the world allowed it, but because someone insisted it be so. Her blade may have been silenced, her body may lie beneath pine roots and temple stone, but her story continues to slice through centuries of forgetfulness, sharpening the edges of our collective memory. She took 200 heads in battle, not out of bloodlust, but out of unshakable loyalty. She faced a world that told her to stand aside, and instead, she led a charge. She died unnamed in official records, and yet became immortal in spirit. In a time when voices are still silenced and bravery often goes unrecognized, Nakano Takeko stands as a beacon, a warrior without rank, a leader without command, a daughter of Japan whose soul could not be claimed by empire or time. So the next time you walk through a history that feels too silent, remember this: sometimes the most powerful stories are not the ones written by victors, but the ones whispered by the wind, carried in the blood, and kept alive by those who refuse to forget. What is remembered? Lives. And what is remembered truthfully without compromise, without erasure, sharpens the mind as a blade does the bone. If Nakano Takeko has moved you, let her story live beyond this telling. Share it. Question the histories you've been given, and never underestimate the quiet fury of those the world tried to ignore.